Well, hello, welcome to this Fotospeed YouTube channel with me, Tim Jones, and the amazing Alex Nail has joined me again. We are going to cover how you get your images looking the way they do and the colour inside the images, so more about colour in general and how to actually use those lovely sliders and things in Lightroom. But we're also going to talk a little bit about colour space as well, which is vital and a really interesting topic and very much open for discussion, as we've all found with people and things like that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about something you probably don't know about for our last point. So stick around to the end of the video, because that is a game changer and can really help you to understand kind of what's going on with your colour and things and things like that. So, but before we dive into any of that, please don't forget to subscribe to the Fotospeed YouTube channel and also click the link in the description below to sign up to the Fotospeed newsletter. So I'm going to hand over to Alex now, because he knows much more about this. If you've seen any of Alex's prints or images online and things like that, colour is always spot on. So he's definitely the expert we need for this.
Yeah, so I guess we want to start by just talking about what we actually want from colour. Yeah. And that's probably going to vary from photographer to photographer, to be honest. But for me, I want my colours to be fresh and engaging without being over the top. I hate oversaturated colours. You know, they can fall apart quite easily if you go too far. But I also want accurate colour. I want the colour to represent the scene as I saw it, as I photographed it. And those are two separate things, but they actually have a lot of overlap. If you're starting from a position of accurate colour, it's a lot easier to get those fresh colours, those vibrant colours that are so engaging. So that's a really important point, that I'm talking about accuracy as well, not just how to get the richest colour possible. So I've got 4 images up here on screen. And the first point I'm going to make is simply that sometimes you're shooting and aiming to shoot in conditions where the colours are naturally beautiful. So there's very little we need to do to this image. This is the raw file of a photo I took on the top of Evasion in Fisherfield in northwest Scotland at sunset, perfect snow conditions, crystal clear air. The sun is just dropping below the horizon, or just about to, and we have this lovely pink light. And if I play with the exposure here, we can see there's lovely rich colour in the snow there. And so really all we have to do is just rebalance the shadows and highlights a little bit and add a tiny bit of contrast, and potentially look at our tint here and maybe make it something that I know to be a bit more neutral. And then there's very, very little more that needs to be done to this image, because the colours are just naturally very beautiful. And I think that's worth saying, that that's always the goal, to have the best starting point possible, because that is always going to produce the best results.
Yeah, you should say that these are all raw files Alex is working with today.
You're seeing the unedited behind the curtain. So this is another example. This is in Iceland. The Icelandic moss that is at the edge of some of these streams is just freakishly vibrant. And actually, you have to be very careful here. If I do a similar thing, crushing the highlights and boosting the shadows, just to correct the balance between the sky and the foreground, and adding a bit of contrast. You can see already that actually, even by just adding contrast, this moss almost becomes too vibrant. It really is incredibly intense, that green. So there may even be situations where you have these very saturated colours naturally in the landscape, and I'm actually desaturating them when I'm coming to edit. So that's the other point.
So would you do a localized adjustment on that, just to bring it back down a bit?
Exactly. Yeah. So I'd probably just simply go into the HSL corrections here, and just knock the yellows down, to just kind of try and control the intensity of that moss. But yeah, I can't overemphasize that enough. Start with the best starting point you possibly can. Light is everything in landscape photography. So what about a situation where we thought the scene was beautiful, but the photo looks a bit drab? And this is a great example of that. This is in the Drakensberg, one of my favorite places to go. In fact, I'm headed out there in just over a week's time to lead a couple of tours out there. And this is a view from one of the cliffs looking down into these verdant green valleys, but we're shooting towards the sun. And there is a bit of haze in the air, and it's really washed out the colour. And one way to think about colour is in terms of contrast. Because color really is contrast. So it's actually a difference between color channels. So all colors are made up in the digital space of three colors, red, green, and blue, and they combine to give you your hue, saturation, and brightness. But it's the difference between those three channels that creates saturation or creates hue as well. So when we add contrast, we actually introduce saturation because you're exaggerating that difference between those color channels by adding contrast. And that's effectively what I do to get my colors looking vibrant and fresh, but also accurate. So it starts with setting an accurate white balance, which I'm just going to do very quickly here because I know roughly where it should be, and we're going to discuss that in just a second. But here I want to show this idea of setting a white point and a black point and what that can do to bring colors to life. You can do this with contrast. That creates effectively an S-curve. It's certainly an approach that I would use some of the time. You can also set black and white points. I'm going to do both.
Okay.
For the purposes of this, it's maybe best to be setting white points and black points. And the reason for that is that you maintain contrast consistently through the tonal range. So if you apply a contrast adjustment, you create an S-curve that will create a lot of contrast in your midtones, but it actually compresses the highlights and the shadows. Whereas if you can set white points and black points, you're actually stretching that histogram apart in a linear way. So actually you're increasing contrast across the full tonal range. So that's why I would recommend that approach over just using contrast.
I suppose most people, when greeted with an image like this, they might reach for the clarities and dehazes and those kind of tools.
I mean, we're getting into a whole different rant here because I would very strongly recommend, particularly if you're a beginner photographer, but even potentially if you're a quite advanced photographer, not to use those presence sliders, particularly in a positive sense. So adding clarity, adding texture, and so on, because it can create artifacts in a visual effect that will absolutely ruin an image for me. So one idea you probably want to keep in mind when you're editing images is not to introduce artifice, some sort of barrier to enjoying the scene. And when I'm looking at an image, I don't want to see that the clarity slider has been used. And it's one of those sliders where it's really apparent when it has been used. So I would recommend working on contrast as opposed to your dehazers and those presence sliders in Lightroom. So I've just set a white point. I'm dragging this top point across. That sets a new white point for the image. And you may need to revisit a tutorial on curves or on histograms if you don't understand what's happening here. But you could also do this with a levels adjustment in Photoshop if you wanted to. And here we're setting a black point. And you can see, just as I've set that white point and that black point and added some contrast, just how saturated these colors are becoming. But we can take this one step further. We don't have to stop here. We can actually do the same with the sky. Now we're working with or with the top portion of the image, I should say. We're working with a slightly older version of Lightroom here, so we don't have access to those white points and black points in the local adjustments. You do with the latest versions. But we can actually do a similar thing with contrast here. So we're just adding contrast, and that's going to add that saturation back into the top portion of the image. You can see we're starting to blow out some of that top corner. So you also want to combine that with a small darkening adjustment.
Would you ever use the whites and blacks kind of sliders in there? Or
I personally wouldn't, because I would try to use a curve where I can. If you're interested in exactly what those whites and blacks sliders do, then I actually have a video on my YouTube channel if you did want to check that out.
I'll put a link in there.
So one of the problems with using those two is that if you do have information that exists in the blacks or the whites, you can again end up compressing the contrast, so you bring those tones together. I mean, maybe going in a bit too deep for the purposes of this, but do be careful if you do choose to use those adjustments. And then you might say that the bottom of the image is slightly darker, and we can keep adding these smaller adjustments if we want to. So here I could just slightly lift the brightness of this foreground just to make it a bit more consistent. I mean, a really minuscule adjustment is all you need. And that really is a big part of the secret of how I achieve these fresh colors. Now, I'm just going to go through one more example here, and we're going to talk about white balance, because this is an issue that comes up all the time, particularly when I'm taking people through how to edit their images. if you start off in the wrong place, it doesn't matter how you apply your contrast, you're just going to create problems for yourself. So we're going to take this image here. We're not going to think about white balance, and we're just going to apply contrast, and we're going to set a white point and a black point in much the same way as we did with that last image to cut through the haze and bring in that contrast and bring out that natural color. Now, our white balance isn't radically off, but you can possibly see that towards the top of the frame here, there's a bit of a purple color coming through. And that's because our white balance has been set incorrectly. And you'll quite often see this when you're shooting on auto white balance. The tint in particular can be all over the place. When you're shooting outdoors and you're not shooting under a woodland canopy, which can create green light, and there you might need to use the tint slider. But when you're shooting in an outdoors open scenario lit by the sky, you generally want this tint to be at a neutral point and just set it like that for every single image you take with that particular camera. So I know for this Canon R5, a tint of +8 in Lightroom is about where neutral is. And you can see that magenta disappear. One of the tricks you can use if you don't know what that might be, aside from actually using the white balance dropper, so we could actually just click anywhere on this image and it should more or less give us a similar tint, and typically it hasn't.
A little bit higher.
Yeah. So bad example there, but if you did have something neutral to click on, then using the white balance dropper would help you to figure out what that neutral point is. But one trick is to just increase the vibrance and the saturation to absolutely ridiculous levels. Because if we were then to go back to our tint slider here and set it back on +20, you can see just how obvious that purple is.
Yeah.
So that's one way that you can sort of fine tune your starting point for white balance. And what you're trying to do here is sort of balance the colors. Blues should look a fairly neutral ultramarine blue, not cyan, which they would if we put some green in here, and not purple, which would happen if we put some magenta in. So there's an element of, using your own judgment, but hopefully you guys can find that useful.
A really good tip, actually.
Yeah, and you can do that similarly with temperature, incidentally. I mean, you can see that's getting really yellow, this is getting really blue, and often balancing the two, so we've got some blue and some yellow coming through, is where you would want an image. I quite often set around 5,500 Kelvin, which might be a more accurate way of representing the light. So yeah, I mean, landscape photography is actually a combination of representing the color of the subject accurately, but we also want to capture the color of the light.
Yes.
So that might actually mean that your trees look slightly blue if the light is blue, but we might be choosing to do that. So that's where you can be a bit more creative with the temperature slider. It's a bit more personal taste. So I'm just going to reset the vibrance and saturation, and now you can see that no matter how wild we go with our contrast adjustments, we end up with lovely neutral colors. And having this as a starting point is absolutely essential if you're going to start applying contrast, because contrast will only exaggerate those color casts that you had from setting incorrect white balance. So yeah, that's the two secrets. There's really only two things to it: contrast and an accurate starting point with the white balance.
I think that's the two things that are quite crucial, actually, and something that I've learned, I suppose, that just by those little adjustments, you've got all those other ones like presence and things like that, but just playing with those adjustments. The white balance is crucial, and then that contrast adjustment just brings the colour back out for you.
And we've got a few of my prints on the table here, but I mean, just as an example, none of these images, no matter how colourful, have any form of saturation. It's just contrast. I very rarely use saturation other than to desaturate colours. So actually that photo, I desaturated the blues. They were just slightly too strong. Yeah. So don't rely on your saturation adjustments and so on. It really is about contrast and white balance, and hopefully those beautiful colours will come through.
Because sometimes we can see with the saturation that things can go a little bit astray with artifacts and little bits like that, and noise and
and I think the more editing you do, the more you realise when colours have fallen apart, but because they've been edited excessively. So you do have to be very careful. They can be delicate sometimes.
Okay.
So then we're going to talk about colour space.
Yes. So we'll move on to colour space. Because this is the next, I suppose it's the next stage, isn't it, really? It's kind of a natural...
It's certainly something that you need to understand.
Yeah, but it can open a massive can of worms as well, can't it? So, we'll talk about it in terms of what Alex does and kind of his techniques.
I'm going to advocate for closing the can of worms.
Yeah.
So I've always worked in sRGB, which will horrify some photographers, but I'm very technically oriented and I know some of the drawbacks of using sRGB, if you can even call them drawbacks. So as a general overview of color spaces, a color space allows you to select a range of colors, but the size of the color space will determine how saturated those colors can be. So we have some massive spaces like ProPhoto RGB, then we have some large spaces like Adobe RGB, and then we have sRGB, which is really quite small, and then CYMK if you're printing a book, which is tiny.
Yeah.
So I use sRGB, which is the smallest RGB color space, really. And many photographers will either use Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB. Now, what those two color spaces will potentially give you is the ability to have even more saturated colors, which sounds great, just a bigger range of colors to select from. And it's important to say that it's a range as well. It's not like your colors are going to be better.
Yeah, you might be able to get more colors.
Yes.
Or different, such like a green, you might be able to go to a fluorescent or something.
That's right. That's a better analogy. Yeah. So it's like you can create an even more intense color, but it's not necessarily more colors because we can still separate a ridiculous number of hues no matter how small the color space. And the difference between the three color spaces, were you able to print them out perfectly or perfectly represent them on screen, you would generally only notice by direct comparison. So we are talking about very small differences here in general, and that's an important distinction to make because using these larger color spaces, you do have to know what you're doing.
And I should say the printers have their own color spaces as well.
Yes.
Which complicates a little bit, but we're going to close that lid again on that kind of and move on and talk about color spaces like on the screen in relationship to editing color as well.
So if you do want this expanded range of colors, these more saturated colors, and you want to work in ProPhoto RGB, the first thing to say is no screen can do ProPhoto RGB. So actually it's really only graphics professionals that should be interested in that, in my opinion, not photographers. When it comes to Adobe RGB, it's a different conversation because you can buy screens that cost twice as much as sRGB screens, but you can buy screens that will represent that very accurately, and you can see these more intense colors on your screen, which is
we sell the BenQ
great.
Screens, which do it, and you get 99.9% Adobe RGB on them. I don't know why they can't quite manage that.
No, I don't either, actually. I have wondered that myself.
0.1, but anyway.
99.9. But I mean, that 1% is such a small difference now that you really wouldn't notice a difference. So you can represent those colors on screen. So Adobe RGB is certainly worth considering. And for people who want to offer that as advice, fine. I think that's perfectly good as long as you know what you're doing. So it's important that you know that when you're converting for web, you still need to move into sRGB because most people are still working in these smaller color spaces and they simply won't be able to accurately see the colors which you spent so much time getting right on your fancy screen on their screen. Yeah, exactly. So that's the first point. You need to know how to accurately move between these color spaces, and that includes when you're printing. Because when you're printing, you cannot print. You can print some of the extra cyans actually, but you can't print some of the extra intense reds, for example. Yeah. And so what you actually gain by working in Adobe RGB is very, very small. You get some extra sort of super intense saturated cyans and greens. And maybe the tiniest whisker of reds, but it's very limited what you're actually gaining, but you've created this extra complexity that you need to know how to move between color spaces. Whereas with sRGB, you can pretty much print the entire color space. You can accurately represent it on anybody's screen, including the Apple P3 color spaces, which everybody's got on their phones and laptops and tablets. So it's a much easier, straightforward solution to the color space problem. And if you want just one answer for me, it would be to use sRGB. And to illustrate that, we have two very colorful photos here.
Okay.
So this for me is a colourful photo that is verging on too colourful. I mean, it's naturally colourful, but we can nevertheless, if we want to, make it more colourful. We can, add vibrance and saturation and go completely nuts here. But as you're watching this video back, we're watching this in a Rec 709 colour space, which is actually very similar to sRGB. So however intense you can see this colour on your screen currently is within the sRGB colour space. If you're not happy with that level of colour intensity, I'd suggest you're not a landscape photographer and you're maybe more of a digital artist. I don't know, but for me, this is mega unpleasant, intense colour, and yet we're still within sRGB. And we've got another, you can see just how much less saturated this is. So this is well within the sRGB color space, which means that it's well within any color space. And we can print it accurately, represent it on screen accurately. And this is another example, very saturated image. And in fact, in this case, we're pretty close to clipping in the red channel in the sRGB space. But nevertheless, you just don't need more color than this. So my question really to anybody who wants to work in these larger spaces is, what do you want those even more saturated colors for? And there are just a couple of scenarios. Maybe if you're shooting sunlight refracting through seawater, you get these really intense greens and cyans. Maybe you'd get a small advantage from Adobe RGB. Or if you're shooting the aurora with those crazy greens, maybe again Adobe RGB would give you a little helping hand at representing just the intensity of that color.
I think for most photographers, we'd be within that sRGB range most of the time.
And if you wanted to shoot in Adobe RGB and all of your images were well within Adobe RGB, fine. You just have to remember that you've got these extra steps and you just need to be that little bit more careful. Most professionals do still work in Adobe RGB, but I would suggest that sRGB is sufficient.
We do recommend people to use Adobe RGB because with the 10, 12 ink printers, it's not perfect. Like you said, there is mismatches going on, but it's probably it's closer to what the printer, as long as you've got those 10, 12 inks in there, is closer to what can come out of the printer on paper.
In terms of that total range, those most saturated colours.
But that isn't taking into account paper and things like that, which can have their own range of reproduction as well. But we're not going to go there.
But I mean,
but anyway,
I know because I've tested it. I know for a fact that if I take one of my Aurora images and I stay in Adobe RGB and I print in Adobe RGB, I can get more saturated colors in that Aurora. So there are some very specific scenarios where there is an advantage, but not one that I care about because I'd rather have those more subdued colors and not have the headache, to be perfectly honest. Okay, so that's a fairly technical thing in itself, but we're going to go on to something even more technical, maybe.
Before we move on, very briefly, you touched on some extra little steps and problems with Adobe RGB. What would they consist of?
So really, you just need to remember that when you are moving into different color spaces, so into the printer gamut or into sRGB, you need to be making that conversion accurately, and potentially you might want to then edit the image afterwards to recover some of what has changed in that shift into a different color space. It might just come down a little bit
color-wise. It might just be a little bit less vibrant or something.
That's exactly right. So in most cases, people won't really be able to even perceive a difference, or there'll be no difference at all because you were already within the sRGB gamut, let's say. But in Lightroom, you can export as sRGB if you want to go straight to something that you can put on the web. When you're printing, you're applying that printer profile, which is the gamut, which should, when you choose perceptual or relative colorimetric rendering intents, it should shift into that new color space. Or in Photoshop, you can do convert to profile and various other means of checking your colors if you are working in that bigger space.
The only problems I've had moving between color spaces when you go up from sRGB to Adobe RGB or Profile, and then it tries to guess.
Yeah, well, so you have to be careful how you do that.
The information isn't there, is it? Yeah. So it tries to guess, and usually it comes out a bit strange. in some cases.
Yeah, so that does depend how you apply the profile. If you are converting to profile and using a perceptual or relative colorimetric rendering intent, or even absolute colorimetric when you're going up, you should have perfectly accurate changes. If you were to just apply Adobe RGB, then you're going to get some really funky colors. So, I mean, this is the issue with moving between color spaces, and one of the reasons that if you are using these larger spaces, you want to understand what you're doing.
Yeah. Right. So let's move on to the final point. Like I said, that it's probably something that most of you probably aren't aware of. I wasn't really aware of it until Alex said about it. So I'll let Alex explain though, because he knows a lot more about this than me. And it's something called twisted color.
Yeah, or something that I've come to call that. I'm not sure quite where I got that name from. I think it might have been Tim Parkin, but anyway, twisted color is a good way of describing it, because we're talking about hue shift, so the actual color itself changing with brightness. This is a DNG file. It's the combination of 3 images that I shot in the Drakensberg in a scenario that I will never be able to edit, incidentally, for reasons that we're going to go into. But if I just play with the exposure here, you can see that there's plenty of information in both the sky and in the foreground here. You can see these amazing cliffs, which are hundreds of meters high. It's a pretty spectacular thing to see. But this is the thing that I'd like to bring to your attention, that I hadn't noticed for many, many years, I have to say, until Tim explained this to me. If I turn the exposure right down here, I'd like you to look at the color in the sky here. And you can see that there's a fairly rich orange, almost a red, and certainly this top portion of the sky is quite red. But if we boost the exposure, you'll see that near the horizon we go to yellow or even white. And here we're going to a much yellower orange. Here we're going from red to orange. And as we keep pushing this exposure, you'll see that same hue shift happening until, the cloud at the top here that was originally red is actually being rendered as white and as yellow. So we've seen a huge change in the hue of the color, because we've gone from red to yellow. And why is that happening? That's happening because the red channel is saturated or close to saturated, depending on how Lightroom is actually protecting the colors, because Lightroom is pretty clever with this sort of stuff. But nevertheless, there's only so bright the red channel can become. And then when you're telling Lightroom to go brighter and brighter and brighter, as we are when we're adjusting this exposure slider, the only way it can do that is to brighten the other color channels. And in this case, the green channel is going to come up first, with the blue quite a long way behind it. And that green channel is going to make the color more yellow and yellower and yellower. And that's because red plus green equals yellow in the RGB world. So that's what's happening there. It's something really weird, where as you increase the brightness of the sky, the actual color of the sky changes. And that isn't something that we would see, obviously. You see this red color and it just extends all the way to the horizon, because our eyes have a far greater ability to see color and contrast range than a computer or a print ever could. And that's largely due to the natural world having this enormous contrast range. The sky is intensely bright, these shadows are incredibly dark. And we actually wouldn't want the screen to be able to do that, because if it did, we'd have the sky's brightness shining at our eyes out of the screen, which would be incredibly unpleasant, even if it were possible.
Completely over the top.
Yeah. So how do we solve this? Well, the answer is I don't have a good answer for that. I'm actually just explaining a problem here, but it might help some of you guys understand why some images are just so hard to edit. Because if we want to keep that color as intense as it was, I mean, one thing we can do just as a very quick and rough edit here is to crush the highlights and boost the shadows. And I wouldn't necessarily advocate doing that for this image.
When you are doing bits like this, do you ever look at the histogram up here, or do you more use the levels?
I don't tend to. So for me, the histogram comes in a little later, but that's largely because I'm fairly attuned now to seeing the tones in the image. Certainly the histogram is a really useful learning tool. So if you're wondering how bright an image is and whether you've got whites, then definitely start referring to that histogram. So to me, this photo, even without adding contrast, we can add a little bit here, looks really weird, because the sky looks just far too dark to be light in the foreground, which looks quite bright in comparison to the sky. And yet the foreground itself still remains fairly dark. I mean, if you were to print this, it would look sort of muddy on the wall.
Yeah. It's almost upside down.
Yeah.
Kind of...
I mean, you want the foreground to be even brighter, but if you make the foreground even brighter, I mean, we can do that with a linear gradient here. I mean, let's say that we were to brighten this foreground a little bit more still. That's where you might want it to lie for the purposes of a print. I mean, that's even more ridiculous because the sky just looks too dark compared to the foreground that is lit by it.
It's too dramatic.
And yet, we've got this problem that the colour in the sky is completely inaccurate because we've made it too bright. So we'd actually need to darken down the sky to get those reds back. You know, so now the sky is looking close to the colour that we saw with our eyes. And yet, to get the foreground bright enough, we need to go even further. And this is where, I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. I mean, obviously, these two things are just completely contradictory goals. And we're never going to be able to bring these two back together. And that's just the limitations of the screen or of a print. But at least one way that you can usefully bring this forward is thinking about exactly how bright you can get a sky to be before those colours just start to go too far from what they initially were. And that's something that I really care about, that I'll do a lot of very careful local edits to manage. So arguably, I've just given everybody watching this a massive headache, and they've now realised there's a problem that they never knew about before. But there you go, something interesting maybe.
It could, when you're really struggling with an image and you're trying to balance like this image here, that it might be the case that you never will be able to fully do it, and it might be better to move on, perhaps.
Or just
some
find
cases.
the best compromise you can. But I mean, I suppose it's a good excuse to forgive yourself that you're not a terrible photographer if you can't make a great photo out of this sort of lighting condition, because I definitely don't know how. And if you know how, please tell me, because I want to know. Yeah.
But yeah, it's really interesting how just the exposure can change your colours, and that kind of. But this picture also, I should say, really shows the dynamic. So this picture here really showed like a dynamic range of cameras now, and how much detail you can actually pull out of them as well. That's probably a whole nother conversation, but there's always loads of detail there.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually the combination of 3 exposures already, but even as a single exposure now with the R5 and the new Nikon cameras, you can pretty much pull all of this information back. They really are pretty amazing, which is a nice development.
Yeah, and it's finding that compromise sometimes between those two opposites kind of happening, and bring it all back in. Which I suppose is what now it's got on the screen now. A bit of a compromise.
I mean, I could probably be a bit more picky and do a better job of it, but I mean, I'm going to end up somewhere around here, and I'm never quite going to be satisfied with an amazing scene like that then just doesn't feel quite right when it's represented on screen.
Yeah, I suppose it goes back to looking for those moments actually in the field as well, and kind of having something a bit in your mind.
Yeah, I mean, I should have included the photo that I took in the opposite direction, which is then taking advantage of that lovely colour in the sky, lighting the landscape, as opposed to shooting the sky itself, because that was a better photo, but you'll have to imagine it was amazing.
We just use this one for demonstration purposes. But that's given me definitely a lot to think about with colour. Certainly kind of inspire me to do a little bit more as well. As always, I want to thank Alex for coming on and explaining that, because it's something that editing colour is a different world a little bit for me. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Now, as always, don't forget to subscribe to the Fotospeed YouTube channel. And also don't forget to subscribe to the Fotospeed newsletter. I'll put a link in the description below, and that will keep you up to date with all the news from us here at Fotospeed, and also have some exclusive discounts as well for Fotospeed products, and also any other products we sell here at Fotospeed. So all that's left for me to do is thank Alex again for coming on and giving a little bit of a crash course, I suppose, those 3 points.
Yeah, maybe rushing through too much into little time, but there you go. Hopefully it's
if you have any questions, don't forget, pop them in the comments below. And also check out Alex's YouTube channel as well, because he's done full kind of run-throughs of some of this, haven't you,
Yeah,
on there, explaining colour spaces and all that kind of thing as well. So well worth a look. I'll put a link again below. So on that note, we will see you next week, and bye-bye.
Goodbye.